Welcome, everyone. This is Rob Waters, Program Director with State Hit Connect. We're very excited to get everything started for today's Industry Insights webinar sponsored by MarkLogic. We had really strong interest in this topic from a wide variety of states from across the country. The topic is driving the value of code sets with Semantics, with the subheader provider crosswalks and record classification. Some really innovative work being done here by the MarkLogic team. Today's session is going to be kicked off by Gary Katz, Medicaid and HHS lead with MarkLogic. Joining him is Stephen Reed, Senior Account Executive, also with MarkLogic, and a further colleague, Jim Morris, Senior Solutions Consultant. So I'm going to pass this over without further ado to Gary, and he's going to get things started. Do keep in mind from a housekeeping perspective, enter your questions into the Slido chat box whenever they come to mind throughout. I think this will be a stimulating conversation from the outset, exploring some of these possibilities. So get those into the chat box and we'll get those queued up for the Q&A for the interactive part of this session. Welcome, Gary.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rob. And thank you, State Health IT Connect, for having us today. I'm very excited to actually make this presentation. When folks hear of MarkLogic, they are typically thinking, particularly in this community, of our data hub for Medicaid. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to introduce some other folks from the other side of MarkLogic. MarkLogic last year acquired a company called SmartLogic that has a product called Semaphore. And it provides a tremendous amount of value in being able to understand contextual relationships from a semantic perspective, whether it's highly structured data or whether it's unstructured data, to be able to correlate that together, which is a natural play with what MarkLogic does. So we're going to have a session today where I'm going to sort of introduce us to the Semaphore team of Stephen Reed and Jim Morris to talk about some work that we did with a state to understand code sets and do code set crosswalks, and then do a little bit more and understand how we can actually help augment the experience of analysts and business users to suggest codes that might be relevant to the work that they're doing based off of narrative context that might be available in caseworks or in diagnosis files or medical records. Next slide, please. And once more. Okay, so just from the top down, MarkLogic is the provider of a data hub for Medicaid. And we have been developing this over a period of time. Now, we're known for taking in, new and changing unforeseen data, combining ODS, MPI, and EDW capabilities, facilitating interoperability through our FHIR accelerators, as well as the ability to have our own healthcare starter kit as a sample project geared towards payer environments such as Medicaid, as well as commercial payers, so that you can leverage a FHIR-friendly persistent data model and have your security and data mappings already set up for you so that you're about 60 to 70% of the way before you start customizing it for your own specific application. What we added to the Data Hub for Medicaid, next slide, please, is a semantic data catalog. And this is where Semaphore comes in to be able to augment the reference data that we have, as well as provide further enriched data into the Data Hub for Medicaid. So next slide. What kinds of problems does a semantic data catalog solve, or specifically does Semaphore solve? If I have a lot of different vocabularies, if I'm dealing in highly structured semantic data, if I'm dealing in NUCC data and NICE data, and I'm trying to do a crosswalk between those different taxonomies, that's certainly one use case. But what happens when I have a slip and fall that occurs inside of caseworker notes, and I want to be able to produce the ICD-10 code for that, or provide a suggestion for a set of codes that might be relevant? What happens when I have a diagnosis code of someone has a migraine? I want to make sure that the procedure code that's associated with that isn't that we should amputate their foot. So there are a lot of different contextual things that we can use at the metadata level that the semantics of Semaphore helps us to identify earlier and then augment the analysts and business users' ability to correlate that data together, both from the individual usage perspective, but also at scale in production. So with that context, I'm going to transition now to Stephen Reed with Semaphore to give an overview of these capabilities, and then Jim to provide some demonstrative capabilities that represent what this can mean for Medicaid and HHS clients. Steve, to you.
Gary, thanks so much. So again, my name is Stephen Reed. I'm located outside of the Washington, D.C. area and very happy to be on today's broadcast with you all. So we thought we'd start with a bit of a fictitious state. We're calling it the state of MarkLogic. It's actually I'll say a summary of multiple conversations that we've had with various states about the challenges that they've had with the various code sets that they've been trying to manage. So we kind of summarized them here, but I'm just going to walk through them quickly and just kind of highlight some of the things that I think are really, really important to call out. One is this concept of, when I have multiple code sets, I really have multiple languages to talk about the same thing. That often causes a lot of confusion. And then specifically, if I'm trying to answer a question that's in one code set, making that connection to another code set to actually find that answer is also very challenging. We've also seen that there's a lot of inefficient change controls over how code sets are managed. And what we mean by that is, although the code set itself may be very well defined, how they're particularly implemented in any organization varies slightly from organization to organization. So keeping track of those changes and what they actually mean inside of an organization, we see it as a difficult challenge. And then I'll call this as the problem that we see pretty much everywhere, which is a lot of information still lives in silos. How do I collapse these silos down and potentially look at my data in new ways, like in knowledge graphs? So with those challenges kind of framing the background, where they were trying to get is kind of the desired end state here is like being able to quickly make linkages between the code sets using visualization tools, right? Giving people the ability to kind of just have a really quick way to navigate the code sets and crosswalks between those code sets. But really thinking of it as a service, right? How do I make this service available to everyone in my organization that applications can use potentially through an API or users can just explore to learn more about them? Additionally, we need to provide a governance model, right? I have code sets. They're associated to certain fields and records inside my systems. How do I link those together and how to provide a model for change control? How do I eliminate the data silos across my organization so that I can start linking things together? And finally, as Gary was referencing, can I use this to improve the efficiency of my medical coding via automation? So how do we begin this journey? Well, the journey begins with putting together a semantic data catalog. A semantic data catalog generally consists of these three things. You have a data definition, which you may or may not fully control. It may be an external data definition that you're receiving from another organization. You have your data catalog, which basically is the representation of how that data definitions lives within your own systems and potentially relationships to other systems and other terms. And then finally, you have a business glossary. This is basically how people talk about the data within your organization. One of my favorite examples to always use is social security number. How many different ways can we reference the concept social security number through my various data catalogs and data definitions? Maybe in one source, it's referred to an employee identification number. Another one could be tax identification number. In a human resources record in PDF, it could have been literally the text string social space security space number. These are basically all different ways of talking about the same concept, but they're represented differently based on the data definition and potentially the catalog in which they reside. The interesting part of this, if anyone is exploring knowledge graphs, having a semantic data catalog is very important to your first steps in building your knowledge graph application. So the first step of this process, how do we get all these data definitions into Semaphore? So if you're currently using spreadsheets to manage your data definitions, I'll just say you're not alone. I would say 8 out of 10 clients that we ask, how do you currently manage your data governance right now? A lot of times we get the response back, Excel spreadsheets. So the first thing is, how do we import those all in? The good news is we have a lot of wizard tools to import these right in, so you can take all that work you've quote unquote done already inside of spreadsheets, import them into Semaphore, and you basically have a working set and also the governance model as well as a chain control process. The really cool feature about Semaphore 2, it allows anyone to contribute to the model. So you can basically, it's basically the idea of crowdsourcing, right? Anyone in your organization can make a suggestion to how the model should be representative or potential changes to the models. Those things can be brought in, people can review them and then say, yes, this makes sense for me to change. The next step in the flow is, well, what happens when a data definition changes? You know, the old way of doing it would potentially be going line through line of your data definition to say, hey, do I still have this item in my catalog or not? Well, with Semaphore, we can detect unknown or new fields quite readily. So you don't have to go line by line through catalogs anymore, or data definitions anymore. These things can be identified, and then you can take action on them. What might the action be? Maybe if there's a new field that is a part of your data definition, you may have to notify someone, hey, I have this new field, and inside, this example is SAS, inside of SAS, I need to represent that information somehow. So we can also generate a workflow to the SAS system administrator that says, hey, we have this new field. You need to tell us how you want to represent it. And that's also a very important thing from a governance perspective, right? You can have data owners and systems owners be responsible for the individual model representation. So one person can manage the data definition around the SAS environment, another individual can maybe manage the data definitions around the Oracle environment, so on and so forth. And then all these models can be linked together. And that's really, again, kind of the basis of creating a data catalog. The nice thing now is once all changes are made inside a Semaphore, these changes are immediately available to other systems. So a lot of people would say, well, hey, I got to export this and then I have to import it over here and then I have to go through another change control process. In the Semaphore world, these things are available immediately. Once the change is approved, systems can start referencing those changes right away. Now, this is there are widgets that we provide out of the box, but there's also API calls that you can do as well. So a lot of times clients will use this just for managing controlled lists. What's the current list of all the acceptable codes for this field? That would be basically an API call to the Semaphore platform and would retrieve the current code list. So you no longer have to encode those things statically inside the applications that's using that information. And then we can extend that same catalog to basically do augmented encoding. So on the left-hand side of your screen, what you see is a handwritten adverse event report. Now, as you know, these types of reports could be written by various people, doctors, nurses, caseworkers, things like that. So because they're written by different people, they're all going to use their own little different ways of referencing things. They're going to use potentially different word choices, different types of abbreviations. So it's really hard to take a look at anyone's particular case note like that and say, well, what's this really thing about? Well, you can pass those raw unstructured notes through the Semaphore platform, and we can basically apply highly qualified data tags to it. So think of now a situation where I can now run searches on top of this information, either through a search engine or I already have. Sometimes clients will attach this to a BI tool like a Tableau. And the extension there is now I can basically run analytic type reports on unstructured content, right? A lot of people, certainly understand the relationship of running structured reports on Excel databases or Excel spreadsheets and Oracle database and things like that. Now imagine the same power running that on document sets. And that's another feature that the Semaphore platform enables you to have. So with that, I'm going to do a brief introduction of how the Semaphore platform works. It's kind of like the building blocks of the main components. And then I'm going to turn things over to Jim to give a little bit of a demonstration of how we do that all. So basically, there are three components to the Semaphore platform. One is the ability to manage knowledge. This is where the information is stored, where the code sets are stored, where the relationships between those code sets are stored. And again, there's the tools behind there to provide the governance, the crowdsourcing, as I mentioned before, to help build and manage those semantic data models over time. And then I call this the first of the three legs of the stool, right? Now that I have that information inside of Semaphore, what can I do with it? And the what is basically 2 and 3. I can use it, one, to classify data. So I can take a look at a record and say, hey, I know they're using this term to reference thing, but in my organization, the preferred term is this. And Jim will kind of show you an example of that in the demonstration. And then the third leg of the stool is now, how can I integrate that with applications? Kind of that slide that I showed you before of all the various GUI widgets, right? It's really easy in Semaphore to be able to provide these types of semantic information to the other applications that you're already using today. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jim for a demonstration. Jim, off to you.
Okay. I think, yep, there we go. So thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Gary. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Jim Morris. I've been with the MarkLogic organization now for about 8 years. I spent most of my career in pharmaceuticals and R&D and various functions in content management, taxonomy management, enterprise vocabulary management. And what I want to do here today is walk through a couple stories dealing with crosswalks between code sets, and as Stephen was just describing, how we can make use of those vocabularies, generally call them vocabularies, for other purposes like content analysis and validation. So let me switch over to Semaphore here. And let me close this. So Stephen just described the 3 components of major components of Semaphore. Well, here they are. This is the kind of the home page for Semaphore, where you would do your modeling. So you would develop these, what we generally call vocabularies or knowledge models. These include your code sets, your vocabularies, your value sets, your definitions, taxonomies, thesauri, ontologies. All this can be used, and the real power is to combine them. So you're providing more and more context or meaning. Really, that's what we mean by semantic. Providing more context, more meaning to these sets of codes or other types of vocabularies. And then we put those vocabularies or code sets to work via these 2 other components. And we're going to focus a lot on these 2 components. The modeling tool is a very sophisticated but very easy to use tool for managing all those code sets. We're not going to spend any time there at first. We want to focus on the use of these code sets that we're managing in the models. So with that in mind, consider that you've got a large number of code sets. You've got the CPT codes. You've got the NUCC categories. You have, I'll just bring this up so we can look at them. I've got CMS standard terms, CPT. We mentioned ICD-10 procedure codes, as well as the medical terms. The NUCC or NUCC codes, SNOMED. So I've got a whole set of these in here that I'm going to be combining and put to work in different ways. So let's look at one of those ways. Semaphore, as Stephen mentioned, comes out of the box with tools like this visualization tool. And you can see at the top level here, I've got a lot of those code sets I just mentioned between the NUCC and the CPT and ICD and so forth. And the idea being, since Semaphore has made these available, I can search for information very easily. So suppose I'm looking at a claim or a document and it's referencing a code. I don't know what the code is. I don't know what source the code is from. I just want to start taking a look and understand it better. So in this situation, I'm just going to start typing it. And you can see I'm dropped down into the sets of codes. And this could be done, here's a very user interactive demonstration, but this could be done from a drop-down list or a field in a database in the data hub. You can immediately have access to these sources. So suppose I found 0051T here. I can see it's a CPT code, but if I click on it, I'll be taken directly there. And I've got some essential information about that code presented to me. Some of the things I got from the NUCC sources where they were mapping the CPT codes to their own categories. I've got some additional description information, a descriptive explanation of that code. And you can add additional information, and we'll see how these code sets can be tailored. But I have an authoritative version of this code set in my system that I can keep updated from the source, every whenever these particular sources are updated. Now I can start navigating around. So in terms of crosswalks, you can see I've got other links from this code, and these, the colors are indicating different types of code. So I can see that according to NICE, this particular CPT code belongs to a particular category that they use. So I can click on that and navigate there. And from there, I can see, well, I've got a lot of other codes here. I've got the NICE codes, and I have the ICT procedure code. So and as Stephen mentioned earlier on, these are all available through spreadsheets. So that's what we use to load this information in. So they have both the mapping to ICD-10 procedure codes and to the CPT code. So those are all falling under this same category. They're actually different spreadsheets. By loading them in here, I have them in one place. And I have the full definition for this category, and other labels are ways to refer to it. And I can, if I choose to, I can navigate down to some of these other descriptions. I can see this one's another procedure code from ICD-10, etc. So from here, well, let's go somewhere very different. I suppose from procedure codes, let's go to something like the NUCC categories. So I've mapped the NICE categories to NUCC classifications. So you can see that's the one in purple here. If I click on this, I can go there, and here I've got a lot of information from NUCC about this particular classification. I can see that it actually belongs to several categories dealing with cardiac or thoracic procedures. And then I can now I'm kind of focused on the NUCC provider types and specializations. So now I can go directly to, oh, I see I actually have a provider type here. I can navigate up to a higher level in the NUCC codes. I can go back down to where I was, and then I can go. The NUCC provides the link to the specific provider type, and here I have the full description of that provider type from NUCC, the definition. I added a picture just to indicate that that's something else that can be amended to this data, but the rest of this stuff is directly from the source. And I could find this code directly. You can see if I only knew the provider code type, I could have gotten to this via that as well, and gone the other direction. I could have started at this surgery and gone back out to see what procedure codes might be relevant to this specialization. So that's everything except for this picture. Most of what we're seeing here is everything I got from the source. All I did was provide the mappings between the NUCC categories and the procedure categories. Everything else is directly, all the mappings, everything is from the sources. But is that enough? Suppose we want to tailor this. Suppose there are only some, in my particular practice or my state, that I only have certain codes that actually are relevant to what I'm doing or my particular project or use case. So Semaphore is very good at that, at taking these authoritative lists and being able to, you can arrange them or create subsets specifically for your purposes. Kind of like NICE did with those categories. It took those CPT codes and ICD codes from different places, provided them under their own categories. Well, we can do the same thing with our own particular focus. So for example, I have another visualization here. This is the same models that we were looking at before, managed in the same tool, but I've combined them a little differently and I've added additional information to it. So this time, and this I'm calling it the XYZ code set or value set. So in this case, if I want to find information specific to this set of codes. I can search for this by, suppose I'm looking for what the code is for heart transplants. I can see them come up here, and now I've got an entry point to this concept, this procedure code via a different label. So I'm going back to this same procedure code that I selected earlier, but I found it through my own label. So you can see on the right-hand side, remember if we compare it to what we were looking at over here, I've got essential information. I've got the description, the code status, etc. But in my version, that information is still here: code status, procedure description. That's literally the same information that we were looking at before. But I've added additional content, like I've added my own definition. I've added my own label, all to supplement the information I've already given. I've added new categories. So here we have our procedure code, but I've assigned it to a category of cardiac surgery. So here I could go to the NUCC category, because that's still there. That relationship is still a part of the model. But I can go to my own, and here I can have a full description for cardiac surgery. So if I can present this information, for clinicians looking things up, but also to websites for consumer access, to have more maybe consumer-friendly description of these categories that are under a particular category of coverage, right? So you can see on the cardiac surgery, my own XYZ category, I've added specific CPT codes, but the only ones that are relevant to this particular focus of the codes. So you can see the power of this, of having all these codes available to me, but the way I can use parts of them or combine them in ways that do other things for different purposes, maybe be more consumer focused, maybe be focused on a particular specialty or whatever. But let's go one step further. So all these codes are available in Semaphore. You can see we're managing it all here. But now I'm going to make use of them in a different way. I'm going to use them as a source for data validation, content classification, document classification, that type of purpose, because some of these are very rich vocabularies. They have a lot of descriptions and synonyms that we can use to find evidence for those things in text and see if they're correct, or translate them to other values that are directly relevant to a particular consuming system. So what I've done is I created a set of strategies or model. I've combined the models in a way to be able to look at a claims data as an example. I've got two examples. One is looking at actual claim data, and then another one is looking at a medical note and assessing what procedures and codes might be relevant to that note. So for example, I'm using this. It is a sample set. This isn't real claims data. It's the 837 data example that I'm working with, where we have a myriad of information here. I'm sure most people in the car are familiar with this, where we've got diagnosis codes, procedure codes, a lot of personal information included here. Here I'm looking at a spreadsheet. This could be a table in a document, could be a table in a PDF. It doesn't have to be a spreadsheet. But I want to show you what Semaphore will do with that set of data. And bear in mind that Semaphore is designed, one of the real selling points of Semaphore is how powerful it is in terms of capacity. If you want to process millions and millions of records, Semaphore can scale to handle that. What I'm showing you today is us looking at this one subset of data so we can understand in more detail exactly what can Semaphore do with my source code sets looking at this type of data. So let me take this file and put it in a test interface that we use. And this is that same file that we were just looking at. And I'm going to send it to Semaphore for analysis, essentially. And what we're going to see back is the text that it analyzed and the Semaphore's response to that text. So in terms of, do the fields need to change their name? Are the values that in the claims, do they match up to what we're expecting, et cetera? So let me send that. Semaphore is looking at the document. It's applying its natural language processing engine to it. It's detecting all kinds of things. I'm going to focus specifically on what it found in terms of information in the patient table. It's interesting, because this has personal information, it found a lot of social security numbers. I'm sure they're faked for this data. You can see them here, but it found a lot of information like that. So in people's names, so we have a set of rules set up here to detect if there's some regulation that might be impacted by this data. That's a very common use case for Semaphore to be able to do that. But let's focus on just the data that we specifically told it to look for. Oops. So you can see the data is on the left. That's that whole, all the information we were just looking at. But what we've done is we've gone through each record and extracted data from it. So if we just focus on some of these basic fields like insured ID number, patient last name, patient first name, let's look at what Semaphore pulled out of that row. And you can see everything we're seeing here, if I just select this whole bunch, is information from this first row. And if I just go down a little further, you can see we have name first, name last. So the fields that it comes with are patient last name, patient first name. So just an example of a basic translation. We're looking at the field name, we're mapping it to a different field name because that's what my consuming application might need to use. Patient ID, I translated the patient. Insurance ID, I named it patient ID, but it's extracting that same data. Oops. But it's also doing some other things. If we look up here at the ICD-10 area, I'm using the clinical ICD-10, and we could see if I extracted literally what is in this table. So I wanted to find out exactly what was in the table. So so it's not exactly translating those codes. I want to see exactly what was entered. So just pull that out and show me what was entered. But if it's a valid ICD-10 code, give me the description as well. So U07.1 is the COVID-19 code. And so we're doing a couple things there. And what if this doesn't match? What if there actually is no ICD-10 code that's entered? So for example, if we look at the second record, we can see it again extracted the literal values. This person had several ICD-10 codes, but it found this 07.2, and at least the version of ICD-10 that I have, that's not a valid code. So it flagged it as such. So we're validating the data against what's correct. It doesn't try to change it because we don't want to try to change what's in these data. We need to know what it is originally, but we can interpret it and say there's something that might need to be looked at here, and it can be flagged for further investigation. We also have an invalid gender code according to what we're looking for. And we also have the CPT codes. Now this is sample data, and I thought this was a little interesting. If we were trying to flag an issue between what was diagnosed and what the procedure was assigned, we might have some things to look at here, because I think just about everybody needed the removal of earwax, which is probably a valuable thing to do, but it doesn't seem to line up with a lot of the diagnoses. In some cases it does, so it wasn't just spitting out anything, it was pulling directly out of the document what the procedures were. But in many cases they, it looked like if this was real data, it might be something to be inspected. So you see what we did here. We took our codes, exact same codes we're using to do our code mapping, but we're using kind of the semantics of those codes, the labels, what are they referred to by, what's the relationship to other codes? And we're using that information to analyze data and make certain decisions about it in terms of validation or mapping it to different values, anything like that. Semaphore is very good at. And when you combine it with the data hub for Medicaid from MarkLogic, you've really got a lot of power here, because MarkLogic, of course, can store all this data as well as full text data and any type of data that you might imagine can be stored in Semaphore and then stored in MarkLogic, and then to be able to have this power to be able to analyze it as well, being part of the same product is pretty powerful. So I want to show you one more example. Again, think along the lines of using these codes and the semantics that we've added to these codes to analyze not data, I mean, this is text data, but it is, these are rows of data in a database. But in this case, I want to show you it accessing just text. Because structured data, is one challenge. It still can be a semantic challenge in terms of understanding what it is, but it's a different challenge from just a blob of text. And those blobs of text, in this field are very important because they represent, social worker notes, case notes, all things that are very important. So let's take a look at it at a different example. Again, I took the same codes. Let's go back up here. So I've taken the same codes, I've published them, but I published it for a specific purpose. I'm focusing on analyzing text like this, and there's no codes in this text. You can see it's this is a social worker or caseworker notes about visiting this person. Something happened while I was there. Somebody tripped, and they had to go to the hospital, and were diagnosed with certain issues. So it's a free text note. So I'm going to do the same thing with using this test interface. Again, you would be looking at thousands, millions of these types of notes in order to do this type of analysis. We're going to look at one piece of text like this just to show what we can do. So right away, Semaphore comes back with a set of responses. And there's a couple things that are interesting here. I wanted to make sure I pointed out. First of all, we found ICD codes. We can see it pulled out the specific ICD codes for things like tripping, fractured hip, mild concussion, elder abuse. So it found evidence for these codes in here, and we could just return the code, but in this case, I returned the description as well. So if we could return anything, is it important? We could return anything that we have in our model associated with this code, whatever we need to do better analysis of this information. You can see I have the SNOMED clinical terms in here as well. So we found, in this case, I didn't return the codes. I just returned the descriptions from SNOMED for the same challenges. A couple of interesting NLP things I wanted to point out. Notice that the label, the string, if you will, the word that we're looking for the SNOMED tripping category is tripping. I mean, it literally is tripping. But because Semaphore is using its NLP engine, it knows that tripping and tripped have the same stem. Semaphore understands the part of speech of every word that it looks at, and it looks at the sentence and it knows how to interpret a lot of things about the text that it's looking at. The other thing that I think is really interesting to point out is notice it's also extracting things like organizations and people. Obviously, we don't have on our set of code sets and taxonomies and so forth. We don't have Francine Smith. We found Francine Smith's name because our NLP engine, our natural language processing engine, can identify people. So if we click on that, we'll see in the text it not just highlighted Francine Smith, but it actually knows that Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Smith is the same Francine. So we've got, it's called like entity chaining, something like that, where we find entities and we can detect where else those same entities are referenced. So we didn't find, 5 people, we only found 1 person. A lot of power under the hood like that could be taken advantage to do very sophisticated analysis with Semaphore. So that's the second example using our classification engine. So if we go back to the top of Semaphore here. So what we looked at was using the models to do what we call semantic enhancement or integration, where we can take that information and push it out to anything, whether it's into a system, into the data hub, into websites. Semaphore is designed not just to manage these things. Semaphore is designed to make them available wherever they might need to be available. And something to add to that, the data that Semaphore manages is actually stored in MarkLogic. So we have all these services that are tended to drive very quick interaction and publish information out to websites and synchronize with other databases and things like that. But it's also a database that's in MarkLogic. So actually, if you're managing this data, all the codes, all the mapping between the codes is already there in the same database or accessible, to the same database. So I wanted to make sure I made that point. And then we looked at the classification capability, where we took those models, published them in a specific way. We call them strategies. So, well, what do you want to do with these codes? What type of information are you looking at? What type of analysis do you want to do? It's not the same as, here's a blob of text. Can your machine figure out what it is? Well, Semaphore can do a lot of that by using its natural language processing engine and finding people, places, things, stuff like that, analyzing noun phrases and things. But Semaphore is what's really the point of Semaphore is, what is your intention? Take the models that you have, model what you're looking for, model what you know, and model what you're trying to find out. And that's what we call a strategy for classification. So it develops these specific rules based on your intention to do an analysis of text. And that text can be in a database. But some people think that a database, oh, that doesn't have any real challenges. Well, it has a lot of challenges. Field names are different. Values in the fields are different. It's all, that's why we kind of label this talk a semantic approach. Because everything, when you get down into it, even single points of data can have semantic challenges. But then we looked at blobs of text that have no, data structure. They have language structure. So we created rules to analyze that that type of text and produce information from it, like identifying codes, identifying other values, identifying entities like people that would be related to codes, that type of combination. So that is the power of Semaphore, looking at the different components. And with that, I think I'll turn it back to Gary, and we can see if there are any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Jim. So I want to, just kind of wrap this up. So when folks think of MarkLogic, they're not typically accustomed to the work that we do in semantics. And I'm going to say the quiet part out loud. Dealing in taxonomies and models and all of this stuff, it is not terribly exciting work. It can be very tedious work. What Semaphore does really well is it helps to capture that in an interface that makes it easy to manage that data, as well as to operationalize that data. And what Jim was showing was how do we manage that data? Well, from the very structured taxonomies to the unstructured component where context matters, right? Understanding you have a person inside of your narrative component of your record that may not have surfaced before. Yeah, Francine Smith is an easy example. Paris Hilton could be a person, place, or organization. So having the ability to suss that out and be able to classify that in an appropriate way, and then be able to use those more rigid, structured semantics to associate appropriate codification thereof, that's all very important work. Again, it's also very tedious. So Semaphore makes it easier to do that. And in operations and at scale, you can benefit from this in a multitude of ways. Next slide, please.
Oops, sorry.
No worries. So if we're going to talk and look at the data hub for Medicaid combined with the semantic data catalog together in operations, there's a lot of different things that can be done. Effectively, what we've done is we have made it a service where from the data hub for Medicaid perspective, you can call out directly to the semantic enhancement server to ask a multitude of kinds of questions. So if I have, a question in one particular, codification set and taxonomy, and I need to get an answer that's in another one, all of those things that Jim was doing inside of the management console, where we were traversing those different graphs, can be pulled back in sub-second response time as the answer to a query, which can be used for any number of purposes. For validation purposes, it can be used for quality assurance purposes, which might be useful for claims adjudication, for instance. It can be used to augment or provide suggestions to end users, or perhaps to provide supplemental analytics, or further enrichment of the data that you're persisting inside of the data hub itself that you may use for other processes downstream. So in looking at this slide, we see how the two interface together from the operational side, but that knowledge management model and the classification component also have that user-facing component where you can have a smaller set of people, your taxonomists and folks who are really into the nuts and bolts of how do I correlate this data together. And they've got an easy and convenient management console available for them to do the specialized work that they do, but that can then be realized in operations downstream by, for other purposes, for all of those purposes I listed above. So this is a really good pairing to be able to, enhance what you have and what you can make sense of inside of the data hub for Medicaid, which is why we're very excited about the ability to leverage these semantic capabilities where context matters and can further enhance what the end user can leverage as part of their operations. So with that, next slide. We're about to wrap up our formal presentation here. I did want to call out that we are going to be at the State Health IT Connect conference in March. We will have a booth, we will have a session. We would love to hear more from you. If this is an area of interest and you've joined us for the code crosswalk section, we can certainly go much deeper and take this into a variety of different use cases for you that may be relevant to the things that you're experiencing on site. And we will be on site and have a conference room available where we can actually sit down and walk through and whiteboard and walk through the whole litany of questions that you may have and see what solutions we can provide for you. We're also available before then. So my email is down at the bottom, gary.katz@marklogic.com. And at this point, next slide, we'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have remaining in today's session. So I'm going to turn to our Q&A session. See some questions that have populated in. First question that I see, are MarkLogic and Semaphore the same package, or are they different pieces of software? Stephen, would you like to handle that?
Sure, Gary. So the products are actually licensed independently, but there is a very strong coupling between the two technologies. So we'd like to say the idea is they're better together. If you think of MarkLogic as your instance data repository, you can kind of think of Semaphore as your metadata repository. And as Jim did mention, if you use our cloud service, if you use the Semaphore cloud service, the actual back end of that right now is MarkLogic. Or if you're currently using MarkLogic, you can also integrate it with Semaphore directly.
All right. Super. Steve, do you want to continue on with the moderation?
Sure. Let me see here. We get this question a lot too. Jim showed an example of that classification. People often want to know, well, how much training does the models rep need in order to support that type of classification capability? So the short answer there is none. So in the world of artificial intelligence, there's basically two branches of AI, if you will. One is machine learning. That's kind of the current buzzword. But there's also another branch of AI that's a little bit more, we like to say, deterministic. Meaning that if I see a certain pattern of things, or if I see certain items in a document or things like that, I can make a decision based on that. And that's really the core of the Semaphore platform's capability. Yes, we do use kind of under the covers a little bit. There is some machine learning that goes on, but that's kind of transparent to the user. So you don't have to train your particular data sets with Semaphore. You can start using it out of the box right away.
See if there are any other questions that are coming in.
This one we get to, how is your product licensed? So there's basically a couple big questions, I would say, or big variables to that. We do sell both the software in cloud form. So you basically subscribe to our cloud service. Or you can use it on your own private cloud as well, too, where it's the exact same software. We're kind of agnostic in that regards. The other kind of, I'll say, two big variables that go into the software licensing costs are basically the number of users. What we really mean by that is the number of basically administrators or taxonomists, if you will, who are actually managing the models and committing changes to it. You can have an unlimited number of basically reviewers or basically read-only users to the system. So when Jim was showing the demonstration of that code crosswalk, you can have an unlimited number of those types of users that are accessing the system. It is gated by processing capacity. So it will be the third leg of the pricing is based on the number of basically CPU cores that you need for your particular data volume. So larger data volumes will need more processing capacity, just how you would think of MarkLogic has kind of like a per core pricing as well too. Gary, are there any other questions that you see?
Well, on the MarkLogic side, I'll answer the question that you had just answered on the licensing, which is MarkLogic and Semaphore are licensed differently. So MarkLogic is primarily on the consumption side, how many, what we call 8 core packs for processing that you need in order to persist and store the data. Although while I don't believe that was the essence of the question that was asked, I do want to note that MarkLogic and Data Hub and Semaphore are sized differently. So in that regard, we do sell them a little differently than each other. And I don't see any further questions here. So with that, I want to thank everyone for their time. If there are any other questions that do trickle in, we'll be certain to answer all of them up electronically. I want to thank you for attending, and Rob Waters, back to you.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think this is a wrap for today's session. I think there's a couple of additional questions coming on. I want to make sure you as moderators had seen some of those, but we'll get to those afterwards, and we can address those at a different time. But that's a wrap for today. Again, the MarkLogic team doing some great innovative work here. This is an area, as with as AI and machine learning and automation become more mainstream, some of this great work, I'm sure we're going to be learning a lot more about. A great opportunity to meet the MarkLogic team, of course, at the upcoming annual meeting, the State Head Connect Summit, upcoming March 6 to 8. State registrations, we've just allocated some more seats for state registration. So if you're attending from a state today, and want to jump on that ASAP, you can do that. Look out for an email from us later today. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.